Well, good morning, everybody. I think we have everybody here online. So I'd like to welcome you to the Built Heritage Committee meeting of June 13th, 2023. I'd like to call the members to order. This hybrid meeting is being facilitated through Zoom and is being held on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, the original custodians of the unceded land in which the city of Ottawa is located. We extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. Since this meeting of the committee is being streamed live on the Ottawa City Council YouTube channel, I'd like to remind participants to please keep your microphones muted until I call upon you to speak. For those participating here in the committee room, please use the microphone in front of you and keep your computer muted. I will provide each committee member with the opportunity to ask questions or comment on each item in the order in which they raise their hand in Zoom. For panelists, the raise hand option is found at the bottom of the participants list. For those calling in, press *9 to raise your hand. The committee coordinator and I will be watching for those cues. Members are also reminded to submit any motions, visual supports, or declarations of interest in writing to the coordinator at their earliest opportunity. Although the deadlines have passed for residents to register to speak and provide written submissions to this committee, they can make written submissions to council. If you have technical difficulties signing into the meeting, you can contact the committee coordinator by calling 613-580-2424, extension 22953. A reminder that if participants are having technical issues with their Zoom connection, they may call in using the backup telephone number provided by the coordinator. In terms of regrets, I've received no regrets, though Member Madigan did inform us before the meeting began that he has a work commitment at 10 a.m. and hopes to join the Zoom meeting afterwards. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, and I think I skipped roll, so let's have the roll call, please.
Councillor Kelly?
Present.
Member Dote?
Yes.
Member Quinn?
Present.
Councillor Troster?
Here.
Member Madigan?
Here.
Councillor Leeper?
Here.
Member Legault?
Here.
Vice-Président Plante?
Ici.
Chair King?
Here. Thank you so much. Once again, are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, are the minutes of Tuesday, May 9th, 2023 confirmed? Confirmed. Thank you. Our first item is on Bill 23, implementation of changes to the Ontario Heritage Act. Before we begin, I'd like to ask Vice Chair Plante to read in a technical amendment motion.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Whereas the report on Bill 23, implementation of changes to the Ontario Heritage Act, proposes changes to the notice bylaw to provide for certain notices to be on the city's website rather than newspapers. And whereas the notice bylaw is 2002-522 and as amended rather than 2018-360, which is cited in the report, therefore be it resolved that the references to bylaw 2018-360 be replaced with reference to bylaw 2002-522 as amended. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. And before I turn it over to staff, I'd like to express my appreciation to our heritage planning staff for all their hard work over the past several months in developing this implementation plan in response to changes to the Ontario Heritage Act. As we know, in November 2022, the provincial government passed Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act. This act introduced sweeping changes to land use planning across Ontario and includes amendments to several distinct pieces of legislation related to the land use planning process. Schedule 6 of the bill includes amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act, which makes changes to several processes related to heritage properties. Most of these amendments came into force on January 1st, 2023, and municipalities are required to comply with these changes. The amendments impact nearly all aspects of heritage conservation across Ontario and will significantly challenge the ability of municipalities, including the City of Ottawa, to conserve their heritage resources. The report that staff is tabling today outlines how Bill 23 will fundamentally change the heritage planning workload. These changes will require several actions, which are outlined in the report. The most significant change to the Act is about the new requirements regarding limiting how long a property may remain on the Heritage Register without designating it. This will require all municipalities in Ontario to review their registrars and begin to designate their listed properties. This is the direction which we have received from the province. Those already on the registrar must be designated within the next 2 years, or they will be removed as listed properties from the registrar. With 4,600 properties on Ottawa's Heritage Registrar requiring designation by the end of 2024, heritage planning staff will have an exponential increase in the volume of their work. This report outlines how staff will address this challenge and contains relevant background information about conformity to provincial policy and the process for public consultation, as well as owner consultation. The report details how heritage staff will develop a streamlined approach without compromising either their analysis and evaluation of applications or the professional recommendations that they provide to the Built Heritage Committee and Council. The report will also detail how existing staff resources will be allocated to prioritize properties and work on designation assessments. We will also hear the recommendations concerning the addition of new staff members to support the effort. While recognizing the significant challenges posed by the amendments to the Act, I'm supportive of the direction proposed by staff as the most effective approach to address concerns regarding development and demolition of listed properties through prioritizing certain types of properties for designation. I once again thank our professional heritage planning staff for creating this detailed response to Bill 23, and I invite staff to provide an overview of their report.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for that. Now you've given our presentation for us. We'll just approve. No, I'm kidding. As Mr. Chair just said, Bill 23 has introduced a significant change in the way in which we need to work in order to conserve the city's heritage. We as a team have spent the last few months kind of digesting this, working with our colleagues around the province, and developing a sort of made in Ottawa approach for how to deal with our heritage register, which is the biggest in the province of Ontario. So we've developed a comprehensive plan, which presents a huge challenge for the city, for the committee, for council, for staff. But we also think we've sort of moved on, where it's an opportunity to refresh our program and refresh the way in which we protect and recognize our heritage. And I think also to prove the rhetoric wrong, that heritage is not the enemy of housing, and that the City of Ottawa has and will continue to take a balanced approach to issues around intensification and heritage, as is outlined in the city's official plan. So I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Greg McPherson, now, who is in a new role in our team as our Bill 23 lead. So he is going to give you an overview of the changes to the Act. I know some of the committee members are new, so you may not know the old Act, but we're going to tell you about the new Act. And then he'll pass it back to me, and I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the recommendations. We'll try to make it as brief as possible, but it is a bit dense. So I hope you don't fall asleep. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Leslie. And next slide, please. So today's presentation has two main parts. So as Leslie mentioned, I'm going to first review and summarize the relevant legislative background and amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act stemming from Bill 23. Then Leslie is going to go over the contents of the report and detail the city's implementation strategy. And next slide, please. So Bill 23, as already mentioned, is fairly extensive, impacting many different pieces of provincial legislation. Most relevant to the work that the Heritage Planning Branch at the City of Ottawa does are three major amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act. So first, some key changes to the functions of the Heritage Register, particularly pertaining to new timelines for listing on the register. Second, changes to the prescribed events process, including some limitations to when designation can occur. And third, revisions to the criteria for determining cultural heritage value or interest. These criteria are typically referred to as Regulation 906, and they've been slightly revised through Bill 23. So I'll start by reviewing the changes to the register. So next slide, please. So as mentioned already, the city has over 4,600 properties listed on the Heritage Register as non-designated properties. Typically, you'll hear about these properties referred to as either listed or registered properties. So prior to Bill 23, the Heritage Register served as a fairly informal method for recognizing a property's heritage value, listing it on the register, and then establishing interim demolition protection for the property. So these properties listed on the register do not have any restrictions to alterations. However, if a property owner wishes to demolish a listed property, they need to provide the city with 60 days notice of their intent to demolish. This 60 days period serves typically as a pause for the city to review the property and consider potential designation. So as shown in this map, the Heritage Register contains many buildings spread out across the city. So the changes that impact the Heritage Register do impact all wards across the entire city. And next slide, please. And just this slide shows some examples of listed buildings. So you can see there's quite a range of buildings that are included on our register, from churches to rural farm properties and modern apartments. Most properties that are listed were added to the register through the Heritage Inventory Project, which was a comprehensive citywide research and inventory project that occurred and concluded in 2019. And next slide, please. And then here's just a few additional properties, so showing some apartments, other rural homes, and then residents as well. And next slide, please. So through Bill 23, the function of the Heritage Register has shifted very considerably. There's now a 2-year limitation to how long a property can be listed on the Heritage Register. If after 2 years, the city has not formally commenced the designation process for a property, it must be removed from the register. Further, if a property is required to be removed from the register because we failed to meet that timeline, it cannot be relisted for a period of 5 years. And next slide, please. And this graphic just shows the new process under the Ontario Heritage Act for listing and removing properties from the register. So under after 2 years from the date of listing a property, it must be removed if a notice of intention to designate, which is essentially the first formal step in designated property, has not been issued. For properties listed prior to Bill 23 coming into effect on January 1st, 2023, this timeline expires on January 1st, 2025. And that's the deadline that applies to the majority of properties listed on our register currently. And next slide, please. The second major change from Bill 23 impacts the prescribed event process. So prescribed events are a process brought into the Ontario Heritage Act as part of a previous bill, Bill 108, and formally tie the Ontario Heritage Act and the Planning Act together. So prescribed events are certain applications under the Planning Act, zoning bylaw amendments, official plan amendments, and subdivision applications. Under the previous OHA, once one of these applications was deemed complete, a 90-day timeline started. Within this timeline, the city would be allowed to designate a property, but if that timeline was missed, designation was not permitted until the planning application was completely finished or disposed of as written under the Act. After Bill 23, this process remains in place with one key change. Previously, the city was able to designate any property within this timeline. However, now only properties that are listed on the register at the time of the planning application being deemed complete are able to be designated within this 9-day timeline. So essentially, this means that the city's ability to designate within the development process has been significantly reduced. And as such, it's likely that city staff will be bringing forward an increased number of listings at a quicker pace than before, likely in advance of planning applications. And next slide, please. So this graphic just conveys that process. So as you can see, subdivision, official plan amendments, or zoning bylaw applications, if a property was listed on the register at the time of receipt of that application, that 90-day timeline is applicable and we would be eligible to designate should we find that the appropriate path forward. But if not, then designation isn't permitted until that application is completely concluded. And next slide, please. Finally, the third key change relates to the criteria for determining cultural heritage value or interest, typically referred to as Regulation 906. And next slide. So the criteria under Regulation 906 have been slightly revised. So on the left here, you can see the old categories that the 9 criteria were previously organized under. So design or physical value, historical or associative value, and then contextual value. Under Bill 23, these categories have been done away with, and the criteria have just been listed 1 through 9. The substantive contents of these criteria haven't been changed, but their organization has shifted. And next slide, please. The more significant change, as shown in this graphic, relates to sort of how these criteria apply within the designation and listing process. So on the left, you can see Part 4, individual designations. So previously, the sort of bar for designations was that a property must meet 1 or more criteria. And under Bill 23, the new rule is that properties must meet 2 or more. So the actual standard for designation has increased. Part 5 designations, previously these criteria did not apply in any sense. But now 25% of properties within a heritage conservation district must meet 2 or more criteria. And then finally, for listings on the register, the previous test was whether or not council believed a property had cultural heritage value or interest. And now a property must formally meet 1 or more criteria. So as you can see, the sort of standard for designation and listing has increased. And in addition, with the shift of appeals related to heritage to the Ontario Land Tribunal, the actual way that we go about justifying designations and other decisions under the Act is now under a lot more scrutiny. And we need to be very, very considerate of how we justify designations, listings, and the creation of HCDs under this new framework. And next slide, please. And just to summarize very quickly, so through the changes from Bill 23 to the Ontario Heritage Act, we've lost the use of the Heritage Register as a monitoring tool, and it's shifted essentially to a step within the designation process, or an optional step within the designation process. The ability to designate during the development process has been restricted. The threshold for designation and listing has increased, and as a result of all of these changes, there's a significantly increased tracking and administrative burden that will go back to staff and also to committee. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Leslie, who's going to detail the actual contents of the report.
Thank you, Greg. Next slide, please. Oh, good. Okay, thank you. So the report recommendations, there are 3 recommendations. Each one has a sub-recommendations. So the first is to implement our legislative compliance strategy. The second is details about administrative and procedural changes. And the third is to revise the branch's work plan. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the first recommendation is related to the strategy for screening and prioritization of non-designated properties listed on the register. So this is kind of the big chunk of work. This is dealing with those 4,600 properties between now and December of next year. As Greg said, the properties are citywide. We won't be able to designate them all. And in fact, they don't all merit designation either. So we do have to sort of pick and choose. And so for the past several months, we've been working to develop a screening and prioritization strategy for these properties. So I'm going to go through that now. If we can go to the next slide. Sorry, just waiting for it to come up. So the screening so far has been taking place on a ward by ward basis. As we finish all the wards, we will go back, I think, and look at typologies. So churches, schools, we'll look at different architectural periods of significance to sort of make sure that we're being consistent and that we've captured everything that we maybe need to capture across the city. So we've broken it into 2 phases. So the first phase is a sort of, I say simple, but simple yes, no. Could this property meet the criteria under Regulation 906? So the criteria for designation that Greg just outlined. So this is going to be based on existing data. So we have very rich data from the Heritage Inventory Project that allows us to know a bit about the history of these properties. Any info we might have on file, as well as staff expertise, both on the criteria and on the contents of the Heritage Register. So in this phase, we're looking at all 4,600 properties. The results will be a yes or a no. So properties that receive a yes will move to phase 2. Properties that receive a no will be recommended either for removal from the register and I'll talk a bit more about that after, or may be included as potential Heritage Conservation District study areas. So phase 2 prioritization. So this is all of the properties that we've said, yes, we think these could meet the criteria. We need to do more work to determine if we're going to recommend them for designation. So in order to prioritize the properties, because we were trying to do a rough estimate yesterday, we're expecting probably somewhere between 500 and 800 properties are going to make it to phase 2 out of the 4,600 on the register. And in order to prioritize those properties, we've developed a strategy based on our official plan policies. So it looks at 4 categories. The first is risk. So this is do staff know that the property is subject to a development application? Is it in an area of high development pressure? Have we been seeing a lot of demolition permits? So we're looking at those sorts of statistics to help us sort of assign a risk value. Obviously, risk can change day by day, depending on if an application comes in tomorrow, then this property will jump to the top of the list. And that is outlined in our official plan policies that basically say that where a property is threatened with demolition, we will consider it for designation immediately. The second is program diversification, and we have a policy in our new official plan that speaks to prioritizing designation of properties associated with people, stories, and themes that are not well represented through the city's designation program. So this might include properties associated with Indigenous history, women's history, LGBTQ2S+ history, or the histories of racialized or marginalized communities and beyond. And so we know that we have significant work to undertake in this area, and we know we're not going to capture everything through this exercise, just given the statutory timelines, but we feel it's a very important lens to apply to this project. We're planning to work with appropriate community groups to help identify those important places. The third category is geography. So traditionally, most of our designated properties are located within the urban core because it is arguably the oldest part of the city. But we do also recognize that we need to do more work in our rural area. Since amalgamation, very little has been designated in the rural area. And that is something that we need to look more broadly at, the history of the rural area, as well as the history of our suburban neighborhoods as well, in terms of that post-war development of the city. Excuse me. And then the final item is design. So heritage conservation generally has, favored high style architectural marvels. While we're trying to move towards telling other stories, we also recognize that there are some very architecturally significant properties on the Heritage Register that are not yet designated. And so we have included this as a final category with a yes/no response. So once everything is scored through these categories, we will have a list that will rank them basically citywide in terms of prioritization. The next step in the process will be to develop that designation work plan. So that's our plan for this summer, which will include consultation, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but also engagement with all the ward councillors and members of this committee to help us identify priorities in your communities for designation as well. So we're going to have a multi-pronged approach to bringing forward as many designation reports as we can in the next 18 months, probably multiple designations per month, beginning this September. And to support this effort, we've created 2 temporary researcher positions in our team. So we have 2 new positions where we have historians who are able to work on basically designation research full-time to help support the increased pressure and timelines. So that is the strategy for screening. So stay tuned for many, many reports coming your way. Hopefully not 4,600. No, definitely not. As many as we can though. So I'm not giving you a number because we know we're probably not going to be able to do them all. Okay, so next slide, please. So recommendation 1B is to receive the information, the approach to the phased removal of select non-designated properties from the register. So as was noted earlier, the act requires that if the city doesn't issue a notice of intention to designate by December 31st, 2024, the property has to be removed from the register and it cannot be relisted for 5 years. However, if the city moves to remove properties from the register prior to December 31st, 2024, it is both heritage and legal staff's opinion that the 5-year restriction on listing does not apply. So it is our intention to try to remove many of these properties from the register prior to December 31st, 2024. Even though that will remove their interim protection, it's a bit of a trade-off in that it will preserve the city's ability to relist these properties should they be threatened with demolition. So we will be bringing forward several reports over the next 12 months recommending large chunks of properties to be removed from the register as we move towards legislative compliance in advance of that December 31st, 2024 timeline. And ultimately, I mean, I think in the end, there will be fewer properties on the register, but it'll just be used in a different way. Okay, next slide, please. Just to provide a very brief overview on sort of some amendments to the heritage designation process regarding consultation and reporting. In the past, we have undertaken significant consultation with property owners in advance of bringing forward a report recommending designation of their property. The Heritage Act has now changed to allow for 2 opportunities for both objection and appeal. And given that, plus the required statutory timelines, we are going to have to limit this back and forth that sometimes takes months and years to undertake. So our plan is that once we have the research prepared and we've determined that a property meets the criteria and we'll be bringing it forward, we will notify the property owner 6 weeks in advance, a minimum of 6 weeks in advance, and give them the opportunity to have a meeting with staff to go over the proposal, ensure that they are well aware of how they can engage in the process. They can make an appearance at this committee, how the appeal and objection process works. The second piece is looking at thematic designation reports. So I spoke a little bit about that already. So perhaps by neighborhood, by building typology, or maybe if there's a large property owner, we're going to do designation of, 5 Catholic churches. I'm just postulating. I don't know how many Catholic churches, but that sort of thing. We may do those in streamlined report format. Next slide, please. So I spoke a little bit earlier about a consultation process. So we do have this statutory timeline that we're dealing with, but we also recognize the importance of heritage conservation in the community. And really, that's the whole reason that we do this, is to protect places that the community values. So we will be developing a strategy for consultation with community associations, historical societies, and other community organizations, as well as the development of a volunteer strategy. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense here, so a consultation strategy is it won't be exhaustive, unfortunately, just given the timelines, but our plan is to do targeted community and neighborhood outreach. That would include Heritage Ottawa, community associations, historical societies, the various groups that will be that are interested in heritage conservation in Ottawa. We will also be doing outreach to members of BHC and ward councillors, targeted outreach to identify community priorities for designation, broad outreach to groups with that may help us identify properties associated with underrepresented communities and peoples in Ottawa's history. We're thinking of doing an online survey to interested members of the public to allow them to identify places that may be important to them, as well as outreach to Ottawa's Indigenous communities, which is a bigger project as well. So we're going to hopefully do this over the course of the summer and fall, and that will help us further refine the prioritization for designation. And then finally, we have a volunteer strategy that we're going to be developing. So since the news of Bill 23 and the implications have come out, we've received many offers to volunteer from community associations, individuals, institutions like Carleton University, on helping us with research or helping us identify priorities. So we are working with all of those groups to develop a strategy within the city's volunteer framework. Next slide, please. So the final item under recommendation 1 is just some general procedural changes to address resourcing and workload implications. So streamlining our reports and notification letters. And then perhaps the piece of interest here is some changes to the pre-application process. So pre-application consultation is not a requirement under the Heritage Act. However, it is something that city staff encourage. And in fact, I would say 95% or more of applicants do undertake pre-consultation with staff and with the community associations. So at this point, we mirror similar to the planning approach where we invite community associations to attend pre-application consultation meetings and we provide comments to community associations. We're recommending some changes to that process to alleviate some of the sort of back and forth that occurs. We had been taking this approach of shared comments between the community association and the city staff, which has proven useful but very onerous in terms of the back and forth and the timelines and very detailed comments. So now we are proposing to invite community associations to come to these meetings, continue that approach, provide written and verbal comments from staff, include the community association on those comments, and then the community association can provide their own comments as well in advance of the application being submitted. Next slide, please. So recommendation 2 are a series of sort of bylaw and procedure amendments. So the first is to discontinue the use of the Heritage Register procedures. So council adopted Heritage Register procedures in 2016. Staff recommend discontinuing the use of these procedures as the Heritage Act has now been updated to have more detailed requirements around processes and timelines. The big change here is that councillors will no longer be able to request a report on designation when an application to demolish comes in where staff are not recommending designation. That being said, that is related to timelines essentially at this point. So what we can commit to doing is that where a councillor is interested in pursuing designation of a property that is proposed for demolition, Heritage staff will work with the councillor's office on the required documentation that is needed to pursue designation at council. So whether that's motions as well as the sort of research documents that are needed. So that is a bit of a shift, but based on the timelines between Bill 109 and the listing requirements, we see this as something we kind of need to do at this point. I think there hopefully will be less of those instances. There haven't been very many, to be honest. So this is something we're recommending that council do. The second piece of this is Ontario Heritage Act notice policy. So right now, the Heritage Act requires that we publish notice for designations in the newspaper. So we currently publish in both English and French. Every time we do a designation, it costs about $1,300 for that publication of the notice. If we are ramping up our designations, as Councillor Troster said, to 4,400 in the next 18 months, that will have a significant budget impact. So we are recommending that in order to streamline processes, that council adopt an alternative notice policy that will allow us to publish these notices online. And then the final piece of that is that in order to ensure that the public is still aware, those who are used to finding them in the newspaper, we are going to work with our public information and media relations staff to develop a strategy around ensuring that the public is aware of this change, whether that's a temporary periodic ad in the newspaper that directs people to the city's website or a variety of other strategies. The third piece of this is to direct staff to bring forward the standard heritage easement bylaw to council for approval. So heritage easements are not a tool that we've used very often, but we expect that we may be able to use them more now where a property owner is in agreement with a conservation approach. So we are recommending that staff bring forward an amendment to the delegated authority bylaw that will allow for staff to enter into these easements. We've also developed a standard template for easements as well. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, we're going to be identifying clusters of properties across the city. So right now that are potential heritage conservation districts. We are recommending that staff be directed to bring forward a list of priority HCD studies for consideration by council and BHC in Q1 of 2024. We'll work with community associations and ward councillors to focus and prioritize areas for consideration. And we will also include the various HCD studies that have already been directed by council in that issue, in that analysis. So the direction would be to bring forward a prioritized work plan for BHC review in Q1 2024. The other piece of this is that given the complexity and labor-intensive nature of HCD studies, staff will develop a general terms of reference for the completion of these studies. The guide will be used for staff, by staff, communities, BHC, and consultants to ensure consistency in approach and to hopefully introduce some efficiencies into the process. Next slide, please. This one is directing staff to develop a monitoring tool for the basically all the properties that have been removed from the Heritage Register. So as I said earlier, the data on the register is very rich. It has been publicly available as a resource to communities, academia, councillors, city staff for several years. We don't want to lose this data, and we also do not want to convey the message to the public that just because these properties have been removed from the register that they don't have any cultural heritage value. I think that value, the properties are removed because we're required to remove them. They're not being removed because we no longer collectively as a city think that they don't have cultural heritage value. These places remain important physical touchstones in our communities, and we think it's important to keep monitoring them and ensure that in the instance that there's pre-consultations, development applications, or building permits, that heritage staff can still be looped into the process, despite the fact that there's no status under the Heritage Act. And then next slide. And then this is just a final piece in order to look at any additional efficiencies that may be found. We recommend that staff be directed to review the delegated authority bylaw again, even though it was just recently amended, in light of Bill 23, to see if there are additional pieces that we can find where we can make the process more efficient and perhaps take some of the workload off of BHC, which will have a heavy agenda in the coming years. I think next slide, the conclusion. So I think as it's clear, the impacts of the legislation are far reaching, have required us to reconsider how the branch operates. Through the recommendations in this report, we've attempted to find a balance between the huge pressure we're under and providing the best service to the public and the best expert advice to Built Heritage Committee and City Council on heritage matters. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that in-depth presentation. We did receive correspondence on this item from both Heritage Ottawa as well as the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Outreach Committee. And we do have a number of registered speakers. We have 2 registered speakers. The first is David Fleming from Heritage Ottawa. Just wanted to ask whether Mr. Fleming wanted to make a comment on this item if this item is going to be carried or not. Sure, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
City staff on a very comprehensive strategy for dealing with a very, very difficult position. We have been aware of the challenges that these various pieces of legislation have meant to the city and to municipalities all over the province in dealing with heritage properties. And very early on in the process, once our fight to prevent them from being approved was over, that's all in the past now. And we have actually met twice with Ms. Collins to give our support for any way that Heritage Ottawa can assist the city in carrying out the objectives of this report. Also included in these meetings were other members of the heritage community, representatives from communities that have heritage conservation districts, and all of us are very committed to supporting this. We realize to some extent in our requests for more consultation or pre-consultation, that we might regret what we ask for, because it's going to take a lot more time for us to do this, and we're going to have to respond very quickly. And we are also working on strategies on how we can do that. But I think it's very important, given the decreased timelines for approvals for official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments, that the city encourage proponents as much as possible to do some pre-consultation with the communities. That has worked out very positively in the past, and I think it's even more important now. So we're on side. We want to help, and thank you.
We appreciate those comments, and we know that it'll be all hands on deck, both from staff, from the committee, and also from the community. So we appreciate those comments. Were there any questions for Mr. Fleming? Seeing none, thank you so much.
Oh, sorry.
And the next speaker on the list is,
It's for staff.
yeah, I figured as much.
Yeah.
So the next registered speaker is Michelle Heyman from Rockcliffe Park Residents Association. And I believe she's online, so we're just elevating her to be able to provide her deputation.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide comments. As you said, my name is Michelle Heyman, and I am Heritage VP for the Rockcliffe Park Residents Association. I would like to thank Heritage staff for this report and all the recommendations to move to protect heritage in the city of Ottawa. In particular, we would like to thank you for retaining the pre-consultation process. It is one that we have felt has had great success. But I would like to speak to recommendation 1E regarding pre-consultation joint comments. So we understand that given the restraints of Bill 23, that streamlining the pre-consultation process is necessary. However, we would like to respectfully request that joint comments still be part of the streamlined process. Submitting joint comments at the pre-consultation stage is extremely important. It is at this point that both the Heritage Planner and the Heritage Committee have the greatest ability to affect an application. Joint comments have more gravitas. Working together with the Heritage Planner to provide comments which align presents clear direction to the applicant. Comments that do not align present confusing direction for the applicant and may result in producing an outcome which does not fully reflect the community's expectation for our Heritage Conservation District. Alignment of comments early on in the process helps to ensure a more successful outcome for the city and the community in preserving our cultural heritage landscape. We respectfully request that providing joint comments remains part of the practice of pre-consultation. Given the importance of this to our community, the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Committee commits to working more quickly to reach a consensus on the joint comments so that the recommendations are provided as a unified response that gives clear direction to the applicant and a better outcome for the heritage conservation for the city of Ottawa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those comments. Are there any questions for Ms. Heyman from committee? And I see that Member Quinn has raised her hand.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Heyman, for your presentation. I agree with your request. I think this the pre-consultation process has been an extremely important and improvement in the designation process and planning application process that has benefited everyone. But I also respect staff's concern about how time-consuming and at times onerous the process can be, which is why it has led to them actually recommending splitting this. So I have a very specific question for you. You did say that, for instance, Rockcliffe has committed to improving the timelines, but can you be more specific about how you see that shortening of the time and the amount of work go into that process that could enable its retention?
Yes, I know, for example, rather than having emails going back and forth, I think it would be very helpful. Often when we do the pre-consultation, in the past, we've taken a few minutes without the applicant being present. And we've discussed what our thoughts and our sentiments are at that point, or not sentiments, but adherence to the heritage plan. And I find that just spending those few minutes to see where we are helps to align the process more quickly. And then having staff give us firm deadlines and us adhering to those deadlines more. Perhaps also us having the ability to reach out directly to the applicant to receive further information that we feel is necessary to clarify information that might be missing on the application that help us to draw conclusions more quickly. Sometimes in the pre-application stage, and this is understandable, not all the information is present that we feel is necessary, and we often have questions, and there is a delay that's created in receiving that information from the applicant. So that's part of, I realize that falls on the applicant, but if we get those questions out sooner, and perhaps if we have the ability to contact the applicant directly, rather than burdening staff with the requirement of receiving our request, then sending it out, then them receiving it and forwarding it back to us. Perhaps we can act in partners that way. And then also just saying, okay, you have one chance or one meeting, and it lasts no more than, let's say, 15 minutes to be in alignment and agree. Sometimes I realize we have to agree to disagree. But at least have the opportunity to take a few minutes to say, look, can we agree on this? I think it would be most helpful. As you know, the recommendations made by community associations and heritage committees, they are recommendations. And they may not be seen by applicants to carry the same weight as a recommendation from heritage staff. So while I appreciate that we still have the ability to offer our comments in separate cover, that often doesn't carry the same weight as the direction received from the city. And I also realize that we haven't lost the ability to comment when an application is already made. However, I feel that so much work and expectations are already quite high by the time the application stage is reached. A lot of time and effort and expense has been used, and there is a reluctance then to be able to have an effect on changes that we suggest.
Okay, thank you very much for that additional information.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for your deputation. We appreciate your comments. Obviously, the input from community associations is very important. And I think that this is a process where we are seeking some calibration. And I think we're going to have to continue to calibrate this process as it goes forward. So we appreciate those comments, very impactful and very meaningful to this committee. Does the committee have any questions for staff? And I do know that member Troster, Councillor Troster, raised her hand first.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you so much for Heritage staff. I know this is just an absolute truckload of work that is being imposed on you, and it's a real rush to make sure that we preserve the heritage properties that are so important to our neighborhoods. In terms of councillor and community involvement, So if I have this correct, what you're saying is that if there's a building that's not designated at the moment and that holds community significance, people better get on that now.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, essentially, we are going to reach out to ward councillors and communities to help us identify properties that are currently on the register that may get removed, that you and your communities think should be designated. So we'll marry that with the sort of prioritization exercise that we're doing under the official plan, and then community priorities, and it'll come together to create some sort of Frankenstein list.
I look forward to the Frankenstein list. Yeah, for those of us who are new councillors too, we really do rely on the knowledge of our community heritage advocates who can help us understand the significance of some of these properties. Is there any impact on things that are already in the work plan? So I know that there's a Golden Triangle Heritage Conservation District study that's still to come. Does this legislation have any potential impacts on that study, or would it limit what a conservation district can do?
There are no particular changes for heritage conservation districts, with the exception of the new criteria that now apply. I don't think that would have a big impact on Golden Triangle, or we also have a West Centertown, Dundonald Park sort of HCD on our work plan as well. That being said, as I mentioned, we're going to identify clusters across the city and look at sort of prioritizing HCD studies. HCD studies are very onerous, Heritage Conservation Districts, sorry, I'm using the acronyms. They're very time-consuming projects. So, and we know that there are going to be many communities who are interested in this as a result of the changes coming, where they're losing properties that are on the register. We've had outreach from a variety of community associations in the last couple of months asking questions about HCDs. So our thought was to sort of put everything in the hopper together, try to figure out what is the highest priority, what's the highest risk, how can we approach this in a reasonable way. So we will still do it, but when, I think, is the question mark right now.
That's great. One more question, and it has to do with demolition. So just to clarify, is the imminence of demolition at all a concern? For instance, if there's an instance of demolition by neglect, which we've seen in my ward, would that qualify a building for heritage designation priority if there's potentially a demolition order?
So risk, yes. So demolition obviously is a risk, would elevate it in the priority. That being said, if its condition is so poor that it requires demolition, it may be a hard sell to try to designate it, but we do, I mean, that is definitely something we look at.
Okay. And so just to be clear, so if something is up for development and it hasn't been designated yet, it can only be designated after the zoning amendment, after the site plan?
So actually, I'm going to ask Greg to answer this. I know it, but I'm going to ask him because he knows it better.
It's a bit of a tricky answer, and it kind of depends on a few conditions or sort of what the situation is. But we've generally retained our ability to designate any building at any time, regardless of its status. The exception there is when there is an active Planning Act application that falls under those sort of prescribed events. So official plan amendment, zoning bylaw amendment, or a subdivision application. So if one of those was in process or deemed complete, there would be sort of 90 days for the city to designate. And then after that 90 days, if we didn't meet that, then we'd be unable to designate until that application was disposed of, which essentially means completed and finalized and everything. And through that, there's the potential that, the building could be gone after that. So that's where that sort of limitation comes in.
Hence the rush. Anyway, thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you so much, Councillor Troster. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks. I've got about 6 questions, which are essentially just for my own clarification. The first one is on page 12. You've described the bulk removal process and staff's assertion that we can do so in order to retain our ability to put them back on because the anniversary date won't apply. Is that a risk? Do other jurisdictions share the same view? Are we going to find out that we were wrong down the road?
I'll let Ms. Enta chime in here, but I'll start. We have discussed this with our colleagues at many of the big municipalities around the province, and most of us have the same interpretation. I think Mr. Mark's advice to me was that we should go this route, but that we won't know for sure until somebody tests it. So when we try to relist something, somebody may test it and say, but our sort of thought is that the trade-off is worth it in terms of like the risk reward potential.
Yeah.
There's no good solution here, essentially.
Okay. Skip that one actually. On page 17, public consultation strategy. In the first bullet speaks to targeted outreach to identify community designation priorities. I just want to make sure you're going to be reaching out to councillors on that as well, right?
Yes, Councillor. I realized this morning when I was rereading this that we accidentally forgot to put you in there, but we will absolutely be reaching out to councillors.
No problem. Thank you. With respect to the shared comments, you will now expect community associations to provide their own comments to the applicant. Will they know who the applicant is and how to reach them? Sometimes reaching property owners is a problem for communities.
Thank you for the question. I think, yes, they will. We'll be working alongside each other still. They will continue to be invited to the pre-application meeting. They will see the city staff comments, and then they can provide their own direct comments to city staff, and we'll forward them to the applicant or to the applicant and CC us. The idea are minor tweaks here to try to find some efficiencies within our current workload.
No, that sounds good. And certainly I'm sympathetic to what I imagine is a very sophisticated operation and understanding of heritage rules on the part of the Rockcliffe Community Association. Trying to work with a less sophisticated organization could potentially introduce some significant delays in the timeline. So I'm supportive of your initiative there. With respect to the 60-day notice of intent to demolish, so on page 22, and you address this a bit in your comments, Leslie, in the under the demolition bullet, what happens when an owner submits that 60-day demolition notice? And as I read this paragraph, I guess I interpreted it to mean that the ward councillor isn't the opinion of the ward councillor or the direction of the ward councillor isn't necessarily going to be sought anymore. So in past, a 60-day notice has come in. You've come to the councillor to say, this one's marginal. We're not proposing to move ahead with the designation unless you'd really like to. And then there's usually a productive discussion that happens as to whether or not the councillor wants to kind of ask you to please move ahead with getting the materials together for a report. You suggested that that's going to change, but your comments today sounded like that's not going to change. So when you first approached the councillor, there's been a 60-day demolition notice. Is the councillor going to have an opportunity to ask you to proceed as though you're going to designate anyways without coming to council for a motion as we've been able to in past?
Thank you for the question. So I guess maybe if we use an example, 501 Cole is a good example. So for those who were not members of the committee last year, we had a 60-day notice came in for demolition of a property in Councillor Leeper's ward. Staff did not recommend designation of the property, but Councillor Leeper and his community felt that it was important. So we brought it forward. Councillor Leeper requested the staff bring forward a report. And then ultimately the property was designated, objected, appealed, etc. So the way the process we're proposing will work now is that we will still notify the ward councillor that we've received a 60-day notice. We will still provide our opinion as to whether or not the property has value. We will still engage in a conversation with the councillor. And I think it just won't be, and maybe actually if I pause and go back and go to other examples, we have also been requested to bring forward designation reports where perhaps the ward councillor is not actually interested in designation and staff are not interested in designation, and it ends up kind of being a lot of research and a lot of work and staff time for a report that is received for information. So we're trying to eliminate some of those unnecessary staff reports, essentially. In the instances where a counselor is interested, I think what we would do is that staff would not write a report, but we would assist the counselor, as we did with your office on 501 Cole, with providing you with the research that we have undertaken, with perhaps drafting motions and statements of cultural heritage value that you could then bring to committee, but not in the context of a staff report. That is our proposed approach.
I'm trying to remember, I thought 501 Cole was a staff report in which you recommended against designation. And I knew full well that you were going to bring a report to committee recommending against designation. And I was going to have to meet that bar of convincing my colleagues to overrule staff. So moving forward, though, you're not going to write those reports recommending refusal of designation. It's going to be up to the counselor to bring those reports forward. But you will be providing, your usual excellent and professional help in terms of making sure that the required elements are there.
Correct. So we wouldn't bring forward the report that says don't designate.
Yep.
We would only bring forward a report if we were recommending designation.
Okay. That's, I'll be curious to see how that works, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's the other thing about all of the items in this report is that this is our first go at this. We're going to have to reassess, I think, as we implement these changes.
And my final question was on page 35. And this is with respect to the screening and prioritization framework for listed properties. And this is a really parochial question on my part, but Ward 15 is kind of in this gray area. You're going to prioritize, or you're proposing that properties that are outside of wards 12, 13, 14, 15, and 17 would be prioritized. And yet you've noted that, most of the registry properties are in wards 12, 13, and 14. Can you help me understand where Ward 15 properties, where we don't have, I think, a representative number of properties designated, is going to fall if you're deprioritizing Ward 15, and I guess Ward 17 as well, in relation to other parts of the city?
I think there are a couple of things. One is that Ward 15 and Ward 17 are, let's say, underrepresented in the context of Wards 12, 13, and 14, but in the context of the greater city, perhaps not underrepresented. Okay. And so Greg can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in our because we used Ward 15 as our sort of test pilot project in developing this rubric. Properties located in an underrepresented ward or neighborhood, it got a score of 1. It didn't get 0. So 2 would be if it was located outside of those wards. It gets a score of 1 if it's in an underrepresented. So we're saying it's underrepresented, but it's not quite as represented, let's say, as 12, 13, or 14.
Okay. I'll be curious to see how the priorities change. We're going to have an opportunity to, when you start bringing forward those bulk refusals, or not bulk refusals, sorry, bulk removals. Thank you. We're going to have the opportunity to push back and bring motions if we need to and all that good stuff. Sure. So it's not our last kick at the can.
No, of course. And we will definitely, we haven't fully figured out the best way to share these lists. Whether we want them, I don't think we want them to be fully public at this point as we're doing our analysis, but I think through consultation with ward councillors and communities, we're going to do our best to kind of help identify priorities. And like you said, you'll have another chance when it comes to committee.
Okay. None of us want to be in this place today, but I'll echo the chair's thanks to staff for doing a lot of work to get us into the best position possible to recognize the new realities. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Member Dote.
Thank you. I have a few questions for the staff as well. The first question that I have is regarding the screening process. So you're looking at the possibility of the structure satisfying at least 2 of the 9 criterias for it to move to prioritization. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Do we have a timeline on the phase 1 screening and the phase 2 prioritization?
The phase 1 screening is basically finished. And then the phase 2 prioritization, just our side of it, because we haven't done the community consultation yet. We're hoping to have the first draft completed by the end of this month.
Okay, great. One more question. Is there a certain amount of time the property needs to be on the register listing after it has been relisted before it can be, before its intent for designation is published?
No. So, and in fact, we don't actually even have to list something to designate it. So we can still move directly to designation unless there is a development application. So the only requirement for it to be listed in advance of designation is if there's a development application. But if it's just any building in any neighborhood and there's no development application associated with it, we can move straight to designation if we want to.
Great. So once we have developed a monitoring tool, I think we'll be able to directly move to designations.
As long as there's no planning application.
Okay.
If we anticipate a planning application, I expect that we will be bringing forward a motion to list something and then perhaps the following month moving to designation because we will have a limited time frame.
Yeah, that sounds like it'll give you enough time to do that. I do have one comment regarding prioritization of individual designations. Since the city is planning to make thematic designation reports, I think it's also important to prioritize inclusion of specific typology structures from each decade in which that typology was built, so that at the end of the exercise, you don't only have the best examples of a typology on the designations, but also the development of that typology within the city. Again, these can be part of the thematic designations which are being planned for anyways. The second thing that I want to comment on to add to what Councillor Truster said was that the online survey for people to identify important structures could also include submissions for properties of heritage value that are facing some kind of risk. Because once the structures are delisted from the register, the department will not receive the intent for demolition. To conclude, it's a very well-oriented report and a great plan of action. Kudos in that. Especially commend the inclusion of typology in prioritization and maintaining their sense of pre-consultation process. The city has clearly worked very hard for. And it's an extremely huge undertaking, but the plan looks really promising. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really beneficial input and for those comments as well. Member Quinn. And that we believe you're on mute, Member Quinn.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to echo what has already been said today about the onerous task and the incredible undertaking for staff, and just how impressive it is and challenging, and how, you've just taken the lead, jumped into this, and brought forward a very comprehensive and impressive report for us to consider today. So I want to thank you very much and let you know how appreciated you all are. I had some of my questions were covered by Councillor Leeper, so I won't repeat, but I do want to just zero in on one area that is a particular concern to me, which is the pre-consultation with communities. Our community input is really just so critical to this process. And I think pages 20 and 21 of your report talk about those changes. And as you indicated to Councillor Leeper, there is still sort of you anticipate an engagement process of some type, although different. I just would like to hear if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, and perhaps if there's any way of strengthening the wording in the report so that it reflects the continued goal of engaging with the community in a more specific way. So take it away.
Thank you. The pre-application consultation process has been a very successful process since we implemented it. We are not proposing to eliminate that process at all. This is really just a proposal to tweak the process. So the major elements of the program will remain. Community associations will continue to be invited to formal pre-application meetings as they are now. They will be able to provide verbal and written comments. And will continue to be notified when an application is actually received. So when the pre-consultation process ends and a formal application is received. We do intend to still discuss applications with communities. The main change is this idea of what we've been calling shared comments. And so in the past, when staff have provided comments at pre-application consultation, it has been related to what are the application requirements, what are some general initial comments on how this proposal might comply or not comply with the Heritage Conservation District Plan, if appropriate, the standards and guidelines, that sort of thing. What it has become, I think in the last couple of years, is a much more detailed process where it has ended up with these shared comments where staff are working through guideline by guideline, policy by policy, and doing a full analysis of a pre-application proposal that may never come to anything. And so we're ending up with, 10 or 15 pages of comments on a pre-application. And then there's a lot of back and forth with the community to try to get everybody on the same page, and it doesn't always work. And, it can take weeks on end, basically, and a lot of back and forth with staff. So we are proposing to maintain the process, maintain the channels of communication, but also sort of strip it back a little bit to not be basically analysis of a full application at the pre-consultation stage. So I want to assure the committee that, our intention here is not to stymie the community or stymie the community's participation in the process at all. It has been very valuable for staff and for the community, I think, and I think for the committee when applications come to the committee. But we are just trying to alleviate some of the administrative burden that has been placed on the planners with the back and forth and timelines and associated issues with the pre-application process as it currently stands.
Okay, thank you for that. Just one more thing on that point. I do recall one of the written submissions that came before us. There even was a suggestion that the community's comments could follow staff comments in the reports, as opposed to being buried further along as they had been prior to the implementation of the community liaison program. So just if those kinds of that's a thoughtful detail could be prioritized, I think it would be, appreciated at the community level as well. Like sometimes it's optics as much as anything. Yeah.
I think we can look into that. I'd have to discuss it with legal. And I think the other piece to the community piece is important, but at the same time, staff's role is to provide expert advice to City Council as professional planners. So we do have to try to balance those two things.
I hear you.
We know better. It's just everybody has to try to work together, and we don't always agree.
I know all about that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those comments as well, Member Quinn. Are there any other additional questions? If seeing none, do any of the members have any comments on this item? Any final comments? I don't see any hands raised, so I will just make a few final comments. So the Built Heritage Committee just heard about the impacts to the city's heritage program because of the recent changes to the Ontario Heritage Act stemming from the province's Bill 23. From a municipal perspective, we must identify, evaluate, and protect heritage properties from the wider perspective of community benefit and in the context of development pressure. Historically, Ottawa has achieved this through listing properties with the understanding that the listed properties would remain as such in perpetuity and could be designated later when required. With the amendments made to the Act through Bill 23, this approach is no longer possible due to the time limitations placed on properties in the Act, as we had just heard. This means that municipalities must begin to pursue designations more aggressively to fulfill their obligations under provincial policy. This is a significant change of approach for the city, but is required in light of the direction from the province. Given the pressures that we've just heard about for analyzing 4,600 properties, staff by necessity must revise its reporting process, enhance its staffing, as well as its upcoming owner consultation and public consultation processes on designation. The city will also consider using volunteers from the community to enhance its designation efforts. And I'm really excited about the prospect of that working hand in hand with communities who value these properties and ensuring that we emphasize as a city that we value these properties as well. Once again, we thank our heritage staff for this in-depth presentation, for the report, and all their hard work. Is the motion carried? Carried, thank you. That was the amending motion. Is the report carried?
Carried.
Carried. Thank you so much. And this report will be submitted to Ottawa City Council tomorrow for consideration. And I'm pleased that that consideration will take place as well in conjunction with the planning considerations that will be going to council tomorrow. The next item in front of us is applications to alter 233 Argyle Avenue and 330 McLeod Street, properties designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And can we please receive a presentation on this report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a little bit more of a straightforward item for the second item of the day. But good morning again. So I'll be discussing alterations proposed at 233 Argyle Avenue and 330 McLeod Street in the Centertown Heritage Conservation District. And just a little bit of background before we start on this item. This item was previously set to be heard by Built Heritage Committee in March of 2023, but some issues with the associated zoning bylaw amendment application did delay that. So this item is now returned and is up for discussion today. So I will go on to the next slide, please. So just to provide some context, this property is located between Bank and O'Connor Street, roughly mid-block in the Centertown Heritage Conservation District. 233 Argyle and 330 McLeod, they abut at their rear yards. And originally this application was proposed sort of as one unified development, which is why this application has been carried forward with the two addresses together. And next slide, please. And then just for a bit of additional context, so 233 Argyle on the left there, that's a 2.5-story red brick house, pretty typical for Centertown, and it's considered a character-defining resource under the Centertown HCD. And then 330 McLeod on the right, that's a 4-story modern apartment building, considered a non-contributing building under the HCD. 233 Argyle currently is used as an office building, and those office uses will continue in addition to residential units proposed. And 330 McLeod is also an apartment building with rooming units, and rooming units will be the proposed use for the new addition as well. And next slide, please. So just to give a little bit of additional context, so this is located near the southern border of the Centertown HCD plan, and the proposed development is subject to the policies of the Centertown and Minto Park HCD plan. And next slide, please. So this shows sort of an isometric view at 233 Argyle. So this proposal is currently also subject to an active zoning bylaw amendment application, which will be at Planning and Housing Committee on the 21st of this month. So the proposal is to add a 3-story, 13-unit rear addition with residential units to the rear of the existing building. So retaining the existing red brick building and adding that addition onto the rear. So the cladding material, as you can see on the sort of interior side yard there, where there's a bit of a access area, is clad in red brick to match the existing building. And then the other cladding is it's a white and beige panel. And just to note, I've confirmed this with the architect, but the panel that sort of appears green on these renderings is actually intended to be more of a brown or a sandstone. And next slide, please. And here's a view of the front of the proposal. So as you can see, there aren't any substantive changes to the front of the building. The applicant has indicated that they will be undertaking some restoration work, just sort of general repairs and upkeep, particularly around that porch and second story deck. So one of the conditions that we've recommended is that final details of those come in advance of the building permit so that we can ensure that appropriate measures are being taken for building conservation on this property here. And next slide, please. So here's just a closer look at the interior at 233 Argyle. So you can see the red brick cladding on the proposed addition. And then next slide, please. And then again, here's the opposite side yard with the panels that are proposed. And next slide, please. And now this is 330 McLeod. So this is the existing apartment building. And you can see that there is the addition proposed at the rear, which will add on an additional 30 rooming house units. From a streetscape perspective, the most substantive change is the rooftop access sort of towards the front of 330 McLeod. And you can see that there's a staircase access that's clad in a brick matching that of the existing building. And I'll go on to the next slide, please. And here's a rendering of what that would look like. Just as you can see, the proposed brick matches that of the and next slide, please. And then finally, here's just a view of the property as well as proposed. And next slide, please. And then finally, for consultation, so the Ward Council Roster is aware of this application, as is Heritage Ottawa. And since this has been this is subject to a zoning bylaw amendment application and is also subject to site plan. There's been a number of pre-consultation meetings. This application in various forms has been around since roughly September 2019. So there's been fairly extensive pre-consultation that's involved the community association as well as planning staff and other professional staff with the city. And in terms of recommendations, on the next slide, please. So as mentioned, so we're recommending that this application be approved to alter both 233 Argyle and 330 McLeod with the condition that the applicant does provide final details of the conservation and restoration work to be undertaken at 233 Argyle Avenue prior to the issuance of a building permit. And next slide, please. And then finally, as is typical for these applications, just delegating authority for minor design changes to the general manager and approving the issuance of heritage permits for these properties with a 2-year expiry. And next slide, please. And that concludes the presentation on this item. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We did receive correspondence from Heritage Ottawa, and we do have a number of registered speakers, including members of the applicant team from FOTEN. And I did see, I believe, a applicant slide presentation. So just wanted to confirm whether the applicants would be providing a presentation today.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. We did provide, or we do have a slide deck prepared, although it does go over much of the same stuff that the staff presentation went over. So I'm happy to hold off on the presentation and just answer any questions if that works.
Okay. Sure. Okay, well, thank you for that. We also, so are there any questions for the applicant team? And I see that member Madigan has rejoined us and has raised his hand to ask some questions.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a couple of minor points looking at the presentation deck that was provided. The existing building at 233 Argyle, heritage building, the foundation is known as being brick, as I understand the graphical legend shown on the drawings. I think for the period that building would have a stone foundation, it's just we should be able to get the details correct, and that might influence the choice of material for foundations for the addition. I don't know if that was picked up by anyone before.
Thank you for those comments. Was there a question specifically for the applicant, or I suppose reaction that you were seeking from the applicant?
I guess it determined the way to look at this. There seems to be perhaps an error or oversight in the document, and if that could be corrected to make sure the information is correct. and if that would influence any choices as the staff go forward with the process of the heritage permit.
Okay. I might have staff respond to that.
Yep, that can be corrected, and we'll also ensure that those issues are corrected prior to the issuance of a building permit, as we do have, we have to sign off on that prior to it being issued.
Great, thank you. That addresses my question. Thank you.
Excellent. Appreciate that. Seeing no other questions for the applicant, we also do have Mr. Fleming registered to speak. Would you be required, or do you need to speak if the committee moves forward and approves this application before us? Thank you so much. So does the committee have any additional questions for staff? Seeing none, is the report carried?
Carried.
Thank you. This report will be submitted to the Planning and Housing Committee on June 21st, 2023 for consideration. Our next item is in-camera items, and there are none. Notices of motion for consideration at subsequent meetings. None have been submitted. Are there any inquiries? Seeing none. Under other business, we do have a planning circulation listed, zoning bylaw amendment and site plan control for 381 Kent Street. That information was emailed to members on May 24th, and the deadline for comments is June 20th. Is there any other business? Seeing none. On adjournment, is the motion carried? Excellent. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. The next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, July 11th, 2023.
Yeah, I'll have some questions for that property when it comes to planning, but I don't have any heritage concerns. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that goes throughout the whole city, I'm sure.
They're doing really